April 1st, 1988. Good Friday. Fort Wayne, Indiana. 20 miles from downtown, along a rural county road, a body was found in a ditch. An 8-year-old girl, strangled, sexually assaulted. The forensic examiners collected DNA from her clothing, evidence that would sit in storage, untouched and unexplained, for 3 decades. The killer had left himself behind, but the police didn't know who he was. Her name was April Tinsley. She was a second grader at Fairfield Elementary School. She sang in the children's choir at Faith United Methodist Church every Sunday morning, her voice clear and steady among the other voices. She had a gap-toothed smile and the kind of personality that made people remember her, not loud, just present, the kind of kid who noticed things, the kind of kid you wanted to know. On the afternoon she disappeared, she was doing what 8-year-olds do during school holidays, moving between houses. Her own, then her friend's house, then back again. The whole afternoon belonged to her, the way it does in spring when the light lasts longer and the world feels bigger and safer than it actually is. She lived in a South Fort Wayne neighborhood where families had lived for generations. Elm trees lined the streets. Children played outside without supervision. Nobody locked their doors. It was the kind of place where tragedy felt impossible because nothing had ever happened there, because nothing was supposed to happen there. At some point that afternoon, the weather changed. Clouds rolled in. It looked like rain. So April walked back to her own house. She was going to get her umbrella. That was all. That was the entire errand. A simple decision made by a child on an ordinary spring day in 1988. She never came back. Her mother reported her missing that same day. The police organized a search. The hours turned into a day. The day turned into 2 days. Every hour that passed made the silence heavier, the possibilities darker. Every hour that passed made parents on that quiet street hold their children closer and think thoughts they didn't want to think. 3 days later, on April 4th, a jogger found her body in a ditch along Country Road 68 in Spencerville, Indiana, 20 miles from the neighborhood where she'd lived, 20 miles from her house. One shoe was discovered about 1,000 feet away, as if it had been lost during something she couldn't stop. The other shoe was never found. The forensic examiners conducted an autopsy. They documented what had happened to her. The sexual assault, the strangulation, the violence. And on her clothing, on the fabric of what she'd been wearing when she went back for her umbrella, they found DNA, a genetic profile that belonged to an unknown male. The killer had left evidence of himself embedded in the fibers of her clothes. The DNA was recovered. It was catalogued. It was preserved. It was placed in evidence storage with a case number and the presumption that someday, somehow, they would find a match. They would find a name. But 1988 didn't have the technology to answer that question. Fort Wayne police worked this case with everything the year had to offer. 5 suspects were identified within weeks. DNA samples were collected from all of them. The samples were sent to a private laboratory in Germantown, Maryland, one of the most advanced facilities in the country at that time. The examiners compared each profile to the unknown DNA recovered from April's clothing. The results came back inconclusive. What that meant was this: the killer's genetic profile existed. It had been recovered. It was sitting there on paper and in computer systems, a complete genetic map of the person who had murdered this child, but without a name to compare it to, without a suspect already identified by other means. That DNA was worthless. It was a fingerprint in an empty room. It was a face no one had ever seen. It was evidence that couldn't prove anything because there was no one to prove it against. In 1988, there were no national DNA databases. No searchable registries. No way to input a genetic profile and search backward through a population, narrowing down by age and sex and geography, looking for a family. The technology that would eventually make genetic genealogy possible didn't exist yet. The infrastructure didn't exist. The knowledge didn't exist. What existed was evidence waiting for a future that hadn't been invented yet. April Tinsley's case went cold. The file was closed. The evidence was boxed and shelved and labeled and forgotten, not by her family, but by the system, by the institutions that were supposed to find her killer. The DNA sat on that shelf for 30 years, waiting, preserved, untouched by the decades that passed around it. Her mother Janet waited too. 2 years after April was murdered, on May 21, 1990, a Fort Wayne detective was called to a barn on the outskirts of town. Someone had written something on the siding. The handwriting was crude. The spelling was wrong. But the message was deliberate, and it was unmistakable. I killed 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Ha ha, I will kill again. He was still out there. He was still in the city. He was still thinking about what he had done. And he wanted the police to know it. He wanted them to understand that he was the one, that this was his crime, that he had power over this narrative. Investigators photographed the message. They processed it for evidence. They ran tests. Nothing. No fingerprints. No witnesses who had seen him. No leads that went anywhere. He had stood at that barn in the darkness with a marker and enough confidence to essentially sign his name to a murder. He had left behind exactly nothing that 1990 could use. The message itself became evidence of arrogance. Evidence of someone so certain he was untouchable that he could taunt the police and expect no consequences. Evidence of a man who believed that time was his ally, that the years would erode evidence, that they would erode memory, that they would erode the will to keep looking. He was wrong about all three. Fort Wayne grew around that crime. The detective who worked April's case in those first days eventually retired. Other detectives rotated through the unit. Files were archived and re-archived. The DNA sat in its evidence box in a climate-controlled storage facility, preserved and waiting and untouched by 30 years of technological advancement, by 30 years of the world changing, by 30 years of a future arriving that nobody in 1988 could have predicted. The killer didn't know what he'd left behind. He thought his DNA was a wall. He thought the distance between genetic evidence and his identity was permanent. He thought the barrier between who he was and what the evidence could prove was impassable. He was wrong. But he didn't know it yet. In the spring of 2004, 16 years after April Tinsley was murdered, Fort Wayne police started getting reports of plastic bags being left near homes. Small bags, left carefully, tucked against fence posts, attached to doorsteps, placed on bicycles parked in front yards, young girls' bicycles. Each bag contained a handwritten note. Some contained more than that. Some contained used condoms. The notes were addressed directly to the girls who lived in those houses. They were handwritten. They were specific. They included details that suggested the author had been watching these children, had identified where they lived, had visited their homes at night and studied which bedrooms were which, had moved through their neighborhoods unseen and unheard. The note said, "Hi, honey, I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped and raped and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim. If you don't report this to the police, and if I don't see this in the paper tomorrow or on the local news, I will blow up your house." He couldn't spell. He could barely construct a sentence. But the message was unmistakable. He was saying, "I am the man who murdered April Tinsley. I have never been caught. I have been watching your daughter. I know where she lives. I will take her the way I took April unless you do exactly what I say. Fort Wayne police intercepted these bags. They collected the physical evidence. They processed the condoms. And when they ran the DNA extracted from those condoms against the profile that had been sitting in storage since 1988, the results matched. It was the same man. 16 years after he killed April Tinsley. 16 years of freedom. 16 years of moving through Fort Wayne as an ordinary person. A person with a job, probably. A person with a home. A person who interacted with other people and blended into the landscape. And then, suddenly, after 16 years of silence, he was reaching out again. He was communicating with police. He was bragging. He was telling them exactly who he was, while also telling them he was unstoppable. He was daring them. The FBI joined the investigation. Their behavioral analysis unit constructed a profile based on the evidence. White male, 40s or 50s, low to medium income, living or working in Northeast Fort Wayne. Not a random killer, not a thrill seeker. A preferential child sex offender. Someone whose desire for children predated April Tinsley. Someone whose desire would outlast her unless he was stopped. Someone whose fantasy had been active for decades. America's Most Wanted ran a segment. The Parabon Laboratory released a composite image generated from genetic markers in the DNA, a facial approximation based entirely on chemistry. A face reconstructed from the killer's blood. They distributed the image. They asked for tips. Calls came in. Leads were investigated. None of them led anywhere. And then he went quiet again. The bags stopped appearing. The notes stopped coming. The plastic baggies against the wheels of children's bicycles disappeared. There was only silence. 17 years of silence. 18 years. 19 years. 27 years now since he killed April Tinsley, and no name to attach to all that evidence. No face to match the composite. No way for the police to find him, because he had never been arrested. He had never appeared in any database. He had never given anyone his DNA voluntarily. He was invisible. But in 2018, something changed. Something that nobody in Fort Wayne police could have predicted. Something that happened thousands of miles away, in a different state, in a different case entirely. April 25th, 2018. Sacramento, California. Police announced the arrest of a 72-year-old retired police officer named Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. 13 confirmed murders. More than 50 sexual assaults. 40 years of predatory violence across California. He had evaded capture for 4 decades. He had lived an entire life under his own name while hiding in plain sight, and they had found him using genealogy. What investigators had done was revolutionary. They had taken DeAngelo's crime scene DNA and uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, a website where ordinary people voluntarily submit their genetic profiles to trace their family trees, to discover their ancestry, to connect with distant relatives. The database didn't return a direct match. It returned hits on distant relatives, people who shared enough genetic material with DeAngelo to suggest a common ancestor somewhere in their family history. Second cousins, third cousins, relatives who had never met, relatives they didn't know existed. But a genetic genealogist named C.C. Moore understood what those distant matches meant. She understood that genealogy and criminal investigation could be merged, that the same techniques used to help adoptees find their biological parents could be used to identify a killer. She built a family tree from the distant matches. She branched backward and forward through generations. She filtered by age and sex and geography. She eliminated candidates one by one. She narrowed the focus tighter and tighter. Thousands of possible matches reduced to hundreds. Hundreds reduced to dozens. dozens reduced to a few reduced to one. Joseph James D'Angelo, a man who had never been arrested for a violent crime, a man who had never given DNA to law enforcement, a man who had lived his entire life under his own name, undetected, until the casual genealogy of his distant relatives led the police directly to him. He was arrested. He confessed. He was convicted. The case that had seemed unsolvable was solved by an entirely new technology, a completely different kind of detective work. 2 weeks after D'Angelo's arrest, while the country was still processing what that arrest meant and what it implied about the future of criminal investigation, a Fort Wayne police detective named Brian Martin was watching the news coverage. He had a cold case. He had 30 years of evidence pointing to an unknown killer. He had DNA that had never been matched to anyone. He picked up his phone. May 11th, 2018. Detective Martin called Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. He told them he wanted to try what had worked in California. He sent them the DNA sample recovered from April Tinsley's clothing in 1988, the sample that had been preserved for 3 decades. He asked them to attempt forensic genealogy. He asked them to upload it to GEDmatch. He asked them to try to find his killer using the same technique that had just captured the Golden State Killer. The response came within 8 hours. Hits. Distant relatives. A genetic connection spreading backward through generations. People who shared enough DNA with the unknown suspect to indicate a common family line. Cece Moore and her team began building a family tree from those matches. They branched out in every direction. They checked ages. They checked geography. They checked physical descriptions based on the Parabon composite generated years earlier. Candidate by candidate, they narrowed the focus. 6 weeks of genealogical research, 6 weeks of elimination, 6 weeks of branching family trees and careful cross-referencing, and the slow, methodical process of finding a man who had been hiding under his own name in a town he had never left. July 2nd, 2018. The genealogical tree narrowed down to a final suspect, a 59-year-old man named John D. Miller. He lived in Grable, Indiana, 15 miles northeast of Fort Wayne, 15 miles from the neighborhood where he had taken April Tinsley 30 years earlier, 15 miles from her house. Detective Brian Martin and his partner, Detective Hetrick, began surveillance. They watched his house. They watched his movements. 2 weeks of patience. 2 weeks of unmarked cars on quiet roads. 2 weeks of knowing, with nearly absolute certainty, that they had found the right person. But knowing wasn't enough. They needed his DNA. They needed something they could test. Something irrefutable. Something that would hold up in court. On July 9th, they searched his trash. From the garbage bags left outside his trailer, investigators recovered 3 used condoms. Those items were sent to the state crime laboratory. The DNA was extracted. The profile was compared against the sample from April Tinsley's clothing recovered in 1988. The results matched. 30 years. 3 decades of evidence pointing nowhere. 30 years of DNA sitting in storage waiting for technology that didn't exist in 1988. And finally, the wall between the genetic evidence and the identity of the killer had collapsed. July 15th, 2018. Detective Martin and Detective Hetrick drove to Grable. They pulled up just as John Miller was arriving home from grocery shopping. He had bags of groceries in the back of his car. Ordinary things, the kind of shopping a person does on a Sunday afternoon when they're running errands and living their life and existing in the world like anyone else. They approached him. They identified themselves. They asked if he would be willing to come to the police station to help them with something they were looking into. He said yes. He left the groceries on the front seat of his car. They would still be there when he got back. He had no idea he wouldn't be coming back. 20 minutes. That's how long the drive from Greville to downtown Fort Wayne takes. 20 minutes. In that time, John Miller sat in the back seat of a police car with the two detectives who had recovered his DNA from his trash. He talked about crossword puzzles. He mentioned that he enjoyed police procedural shows. He told them he never missed an episode of Live PD. He was making conversation. He had no idea what was coming. At the station, they read him his rights. He waived them. They sat in an interview room together, fluorescent lights humming, a table between them, a recorder running. The detectives asked if he had any idea why they were there. John Miller looked at them across the table. He said, "April Tinsley." The room went quiet. When they asked him to explain what happened, he said he couldn't. Then he told them everything. On April 1st, 1988, a Good Friday, he drove into a South Fort Wayne neighborhood. He had planned this. He had a target in mind, or if he didn't have a specific child targeted, he had a specific intention. He was going to take a child. He was going to take her somewhere. He was going to do to her what he had done before and what he wanted to do again. He was driving when he saw her, an 8-year-old girl, walking alone, moving between houses the way children do, going back to her house to get her umbrella because it looked like rain. He asked her to get in the car. She did. He drove her to his trailer. He raped her. And then he put his hands around her throat, and he squeezed until she stopped breathing, until she couldn't tell anyone what he had done, until she was gone. He said it took 10 minutes. After it was over, before dawn on April 2nd, he drove 20 miles east on empty Indiana roads, and he left her in a ditch along Country Road 68. He went back the next day because he wanted to see if it had made the news. He wanted to see if the police had found her yet. He wanted to know if people were looking for her. They were. He knew this because the barn message he left 2 years later referenced her specifically. He referenced her by name. He mocked the police. He bragged about what he had done. He was confident that the wall between his DNA and his identity would hold forever. He thought the distance between genetic evidence and his name was permanent. He was wrong. December 7th, 2018. John D. Miller pleaded guilty to murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement of a victim under the age of 14. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison, 50 years for murder, 30 years for child molestation. His earliest possible release date was set for July 15th, 2058. He would have been 99 years old. Detective Brian Martin said afterward, "We have one less monster on the street. My end game was to get John Miller off the streets forever. And we did that." John D. Miller died in prison on September 4th, 2025. He was 66 years old. He never answered Janet Tinsley's question. She had wanted to know, 30 years ago, what made April stand out to him. What made her the target? Why her? Why that afternoon? He never explained. He never said. The answer died with him. Some answers don't come. But in the months after Miller's arrest, something else began to happen. Something that would change criminal investigation forever. Parabon Nanolabs began uploading other cold case DNA samples to GEDmatch. More than 140 samples went up. More than half of them produced genealogical hits. Detectives across the country began learning the technique. They began using forensic genealogy to close cases that had been cold for decades. Cases went from cold to solved. Victims got names. Families got answers. The wall that had seemed permanent for so long began to crumble. Think about what that means. For 30 years, John Miller believed his DNA was his protection. He left it at April Tinsley's crime scene in 1988. He left it in notes and baggies and condoms across Fort Wayne in 2004. He left it in trash bags outside his own home. He believed it was untraceable. He believed that without a name already in a system somewhere, without a suspect to match it to, the evidence against him would be permanently blind. What he didn't predict was this: that millions of ordinary people would mail their saliva to genealogy companies out of curiosity, that they would want to know where they came from, that they would want to trace their family trees, that distant cousins they had never met, whose names they didn't know, would do the same thing, that all of it, all those casual swabs submitted to public databases, would eventually weave a net so wide and so precise that even a man who had never been arrested, never been catalogued, never appeared in any official database, could be found, not through the database itself, but through the relatives who had submitted their DNA for entirely innocent reasons, through genealogy, through family trees, through the same techniques that help adoptees find their biological parents. The science didn't care what it was used for. It just followed the DNA. April Marie Tinsley was 8 years old. She was a second grader at Fairfield Elementary School. She sang in the children's choir at Faith United Methodist Church on Sunday mornings. She had a gap-toothed smile. She had friends whose houses she moved between on school holidays. She was the kind of kid who noticed things. She was the kind of kid who went back for her umbrella when it looked like rain. She was real. She was a person. She was a child with preferences and habits and personality. She wasn't a victim in a cold case file. She wasn't a statistic in a crime database. She was April. She was the girl who sang in the choir. On April 1st, 1988, a Good Friday afternoon, she went back to her house to get her umbrella. 30 years and 107 days later, a man who had been hiding under his own name in a town he never left confessed to what he did to her. The science that found him had been built quietly, without anyone knowing it, without anyone predicting it, from the DNA of strangers who simply wanted to know where they came from. The barrier between genetic evidence and identity, which had seemed permanent in 1988, finally collapsed in 2018. But it had taken a child's umbrella, and 30 years of waiting, and a murder that nobody solved, and finally, the accidental genealogy of distant relatives to make that collapse possible. April Tinsley went back for her umbrella on a Good Friday afternoon in 1988. She was the kind of kid who did that, who noticed the weather, who made careful decisions, who had a whole afternoon ahead of her and friends to visit, and a life that stretched forward into the future. She was 8 years old. That's all there was. That's all there is. That's what remains. An 8-year-old girl who went back for her umbrella, and a 30-year wall that finally crumbled, and a man who believed he was invisible, finally named, finally caught, finally gone. The DNA was always evidence. It just had to wait for the world to catch up to it.